You're listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers working to imagine the sorts of developments that might dramatically alter what it means to be human. On this live streaming episode, we meet Astronomer Royal, Lord Martin Rees. To give you an idea of how this is going to run, I'll interview Martin for about 45 minutes, followed by an audience Q&A. Now, to help this run smoothly, please type your questions into the YouTube live chat when instructed. This will ensure that I don't miss your question. You can tweet about this event on the hashtag FuturesPodcast, and feel free to share a link to this stream. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel to get alerted to all of our upcoming Futures Podcast events and episodes. Now, according to Lord Martin Rees, humanity has reached a critical juncture. During the next century, we are likely to face a number of existential threats from cyberattacks, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and climate change. Surviving these scenarios will depend on our collective ability to adapt to new ideas and to plan accordingly for tomorrow. In his recent book On the Future, he outlines some of the ways we might leverage science to solve our greatest problems whilst avoiding the dystopian risks. To do this, we must learn to think rationally, globally, and optimistically about the future. So Martin, I want to kick off by asking, what is so special about this century?
Well, Luke, first, thank you very much for having me on your show. And I'll try and not be too unredeemably gloomy and say some cheerful things during the time. But to answer your question, this century is special. And even to an astronomer who is aware that the Earth has been around for 45 million centuries, this is still a special century because it's the first of those 45 million when one species, namely the human species, has the power to determine the future of the planet. And this is for a number of reasons. Firstly, there are more of us. The population is far higher than it ever was. And secondly, we are more interconnected. So if something goes wrong in one part of the world, it may spread globally. And that's certainly what we are seeing with COVID-19 at the moment. But thirdly, we are empowered by technology. So that even a few people have the power to cause massive disruption by cyber and bio attacks. So first, it's the environmental effect of so many people on the planet. Secondly, cascading globally because we're so interconnected. And thirdly, the empowerment of even small groups by these new technologies.
Well, you describe yourself, Martin, as a techno-optimist, but a political pessimist. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm a technical optimist because, of course, we know how wonderful these technologies are. They've made everyone in the world healthier, living longer, reduced infant mortality, and all these things, and enriched our lives in amazing ways. And certainly the population of the world now, which is about 7.8 billion, couldn't all be fed had we not developed far better technology and better agriculture over the last 50 years. So certainly it's very positive that we have these developments. But the problem is that they can be misused. The stakes get higher because of these technologies being so powerful. And as far as the population is concerned, we are in nation states which compete with each other. And if we want to avoid the downsides, well, let's take climate change, for example. We all know that if we go on as we are now, there will be dangerous climate change in the second half of the century. And we've got to do something about it. Everyone knows this. But it's very hard to get politicians to take actions now when the benefit accrues mainly to people in remote parts of the world decades ahead. They've got an urgent agenda. They care about getting votes in the next election, etc. So when I say I'm a political pessimist, it's because nation states don't agree, and also that politicians tend to think short term. Those are the two main worries I have.
Now, in the book, you focus on some very specific technologies. You look at biotechnology, cyber technology, and artificial intelligence. Why do you focus so heavily on these particular novel technologies?
Well, I think they are the most qualitatively new and fast-moving technologies. And when you say bio, that includes a whole lot of things. It includes viruses. It also includes genetic modification, plant breeding, and things like that. So bio is a very broad category. And AI and artificial intelligence, that's also very broad. That meshes into cyber. But also, I do discuss environmental issues because we are, as I said, for the first time, numerous enough and empowered enough to actually change the whole global environment and cause mass extinctions, cause drastic climate change, etc.
Now, the book spends a lot of time looking at this thing called existential threats, and it would be quite easy to spend this entire podcast outlining the multitude of misfortunes that humanity might potentially face. But I want to look more broadly at this concept of risk, because you're very careful to differentiate between this idea of existential threats and extreme risks. So why is it often better to talk about extreme rather than existential risks?
Well, I think existential has the connotations of something that's going to wipe ourselves out completely. And it's very hard to think of any kind of catastrophe that would wipe out every human being. There are some that could, but they're not the likely ones. So I think it's better to talk about extreme risks. And so in my book, I don't say much about the rather rare scenarios that could wipe everyone out, but I do discuss the kind of scenarios which could be setbacks to civilization. And if you ask me for my prognosis, is that we will have a bumpy ride through this century because there will be episodes where a few people cause something like a massive cyber attack or an engineered pandemic which cascades globally, etc. Or we will create very severe climate change, and these will be setbacks to civilization. So I think we have a bumpy ride, and I prefer to use the word extreme threats because that doesn't mean we have to imagine everyone being wiped out. We have to imagine simply that there will be an end to the steady progress that we got used to. And one of my main themes is that we shouldn't be complacent. And we should worry about events which haven't yet happened, but which would be so serious that even one occurrence is too many. There's a very good mantra, which I like to quote, which is the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. And that's true, for instance, of pandemics.
Well, the pandemic is a good example, and perhaps we'll get to that a little bit later, but I do want to touch upon this idea of risk, because when we talk about this idea of existential risks can be seen as a collective noun. It can describe a multitude of things that could potentially happen, but risks can also be used as a verb, certain things that are worth doing. And as you say in the book, any innovation is initially risky, but if we don't take risks as humanity, we might end up foregoing certain benefits. So you personally, what risks do you believe that might be worth actually taking to ensure the survival of humanity?
Well, I mean, I think everyday life is risky, and doing anything does cause risks. But if you think of technology, then of course there is a lot of debate about the risks of new biotech, for instance. Let's take, for instance, genetically modified crops, GM crops. This is a case where many people regard this as too risky. And I think they're being ultra cautious. Mainland Europe has laws which don't allow GM crops, whereas in the United States they are allowed. And I think that if we want to ensure we can feed the world despite climate change, we're going to need GM crops. And I think the point here is that some people take what's called the precautionary principle too far and say that we really shouldn't do anything for the first time because there may be some unenvisioned downside. And there's something in that. We've got to be cautious, but I think we can't take it too far. And in the context of GM crops, we know, for instance, that there are 300 million people in North America who've done a big control experiment. They've eaten this stuff for 20 years or so with no manifest downside. So I thought we could be fairly sure there's been a catastrophe from GM crops. And so I think the EU regulations on that are too cautious. And so there is a trade-off, but we've sometimes got to do things for the first time. But one thing I would say is that if something is going to be done which is new and where there are conceivable downsides, it's very important that the decision to go ahead should be the outcome of broad discussion. What naturally would worry people would be if a few scientists tried to assure the politicians that this thing was quite safe and they should go ahead. There's got to be proper discussion so that disinterested views can prevail and decide if the risk is small enough to be worth taking in order to get a manifest benefit.
I mean, sometimes, regardless of the risks, the actual scientific risks, some things can just receive bad PR. And the GM crop example that you gave is a very good example.
Yes.
There seems to be so many hidden costs of just outright saying no. How do you think we collectively take a more proactionary as opposed to precautionary approach to engineering our way out of any potential threats?
Yes. Well, what went wrong with the GM debate in the UK was that there was a standoff that developed between Monsanto, which of course handled things very insensitively, and environmental campaigners. This standoff had developed and commercial interests had got involved before the public was really aware that there was a debate. There should have been engagement between industry and science and politicians early on. To take another example where things went better, the UK has guidelines for research on human embryos. Up to 14 days is okay, but not after that. And these guidelines have been followed by most other countries. And they were developed in the 1980s by a committee chaired by Mary Warnock, a philosopher. And she and her committee engaged with parliamentarians and with the public and with ethicists and religious leaders and all that, and tried to get a sort of consensus. And that's the way things should be done. And that's a model for how we should deal with any major innovation. And as I say, it wasn't done with GM crops. It was done for embryos. And of course, one issue now is AI and whether there are any uses of AI which, if not dangerous, are unethical. And here again, there needs to be some public discussion to avoid, in this case, not a government, but some multinational conglomerate getting too much power.
Well, when I think about balancing risk and reward, I always think of nuclear energy, and I know you've been heavily involved for many years in the nuclear energy discussion. And recently, we've seen this rise of something called eco-modernism, the eco-modernist approach to energy, where basically they make a compelling argument that nuclear creates the greatest yield of energy with the least amount of waste. Obviously, that small amount of waste is a very dangerous amount of waste, and they basically argue that this is worth doing despite the risks involved with nuclear reactors. Are you sympathetic to that approach?
Yes, I am, and I think that's a very good example because we know that nuclear energy is risky. We know about Chernobyl and all that, but I think the risks have been exaggerated because the number of people killed by radiation dosages from leakages is very small. So I think there's an exaggerated response to, for instance, the Fukushima disaster in Japan. But certainly there are dangers. We should worry about nuclear power stations spreading worldwide because of the risks of things like Fukushima, and also, of course, because of the linkage with nuclear weapons proliferation, unless we have a very powerful international body to control the enrichment of uranium, etc. But I do think myself that when we think of how we're going to provide energy for the world in a way that doesn't produce carbon dioxide, we're going to make a lot of use of wind and solar energy and one or two niche sources of energy like tidal power around the UK, things of that kind. But we do, of course, need some base load when there's no wind and no sun. and we can have storage in batteries or in hydrogen, for instance. But of course, the most obvious base load, which is carbon free, would be nuclear. And I personally think that we should, in this country and in many other countries, go for nuclear. But we should, before any mass production of nuclear reactors, we should do more R&D into so-called fourth generation reactors, because the problem is that the nuclear power stations which exist now, some are very old, and they're all based on 1960s technology. There's been very little R&D and new ideas, but there are lots of possible new designs, including what are called small modular reactors, which can be flexible, can be made in a factory and then moved on the back of a lorry to locations and things like that. And I certainly think that as part of the energy mix, we ought to have R&D into these forms of fission energy, which are cleaner and safer than the ones on which the existing nuclear power stations depend. And of course, I think we should spend up to several $1 billion a year, in my view, on fusion, because that's a long way away, perhaps. But in the context of energy, which the world is spending $5 trillion a year on, or thereabouts, we should surely be spending a few $1 billion a year on ways of exploring how fusion energy could actually work.
Now, to look at an example closer to home about how we balance this idea of risk and reward, I think to COVID-19, and I look at the UK's originally proposed idea of herd immunity as a way to combat COVID-19. Do you think this was an example of one of those risks worth taking, or is that a very problematic approach to something like a pandemic?
Well, I think you're quite right in saying that obviously there is a balance between ensuring that the number of fatalities stays low and avoiding shutting down the entire economy and everyday life. There's clearly a balance. And right from the start, those in charge were trying to strike this balance. But of course, right at the beginning, they were in the dark regarding how rapidly it would spread and how it spread most effectively, etc. And that's why I think we should be a bit indulgent and shouldn't blame them too much, because in retrospect they didn't get everything right. But of course now, when fortunately it's in decline at the moment in this country, we've got to the stage when we are considering a trade-off. We're saying that we could keep people locked down for longer, but that would be very bad for the economy, and more seriously, it would be very bad for children if they can't go back to school and have a sort of constrained environment for longer. So I think the government's probably doing the right thing in this, and let's just hope that they are proved in retrospect to have made the right judgment, balancing risks and benefits.
No.
But that's a difficult case, and there are other examples. There was so-called mad cow disease about 25 years ago, which was a completely unknown disease, and some people thought it might be a major pandemic. In fact, it wasn't. And what happened then was that the government a bit overreacted, but that was understandable because they couldn't rule out it being a disease that killed hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, it only killed 100 people. But at the time, when they had to make a decision, the government said we shouldn't eat beef on the bone and things like that, which was overcautious. But when people didn't know, then I think it was right to be cautious. That was a case when the precautionary principle was applied, probably realistically, because we didn't know.
I want to turn to one of the figures that appears quite dominantly in your book, and that is the character of the posthuman. What is the posthuman, and what do you think, Martin, what do you think a posthuman existence might actually look like?
Well, this is taking us beyond this century and towards science fiction, of course. But one of the new technologies, which we haven't mentioned much yet, is, of course, genetics, and gene modification and all that, CRISPR-Cas9 and all these things, which can be used not just to change plants, not just to remove your propensity to Huntington's disease, but eventually perhaps to make more drastic changes. It's not easy because most of the characteristics of humans, like the way they look and intelligence, etc., are combinations of maybe 10,000 genes. They're not a single gene like what gives you Huntington's disease. And therefore, we can't, if we wanted to, redesign humans. We could only do that when two things happen, which are both a long way in the future. One is being able to analyze enough genomes using AI to decide which combination of genes is optimum for a particular characteristic. And secondly, having decided that, being able to synthesize a genome with those qualities. And those are both a long way away. And of course, it'll raise ethical issues, whether we can do that. But another related thing that people talk about is whether we can enhance humans not by genetics, but by somehow plugging in some extra memory to our brain, a sort of memory store which is electronic. This is talked about, and Elon Musk has this scheme to plug thousands of electrodes into your brain, etc. So this has been talked about, and of course science fiction writers think that this may happen. If you ask me my view, I would hope that these techniques will be pretty heavily regulated on both prudential grounds, because they will have downsides, and also on ethical grounds. I think it would be a new and fundamental kind of inequality if some people were able to enhance themselves genetically. But if I can digress into my favorite subject, which is space, then I think if we look beyond the Earth, then this does become realistic, because if I could digress a bit into space, then we know that humans have been to the moon, etc. And I think by the end of a century, there will be some people establishing a little colony on Mars. I don't think there'll be mass emigration because there's nowhere in our solar system as comfortable as even the South Pole or top of Everest. So I certainly don't agree with Elon Musk and my late colleague Stephen Hawking that we should have mass emigration to Mars. No one will want to go, and dealing with climate change on Earth is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars to make it habitable. So mass emigration is off. But on the other hand, I think that there will be some people who will go to Mars, and I think they'll be funded not by governments, because governments are risk averse when they're controlling the lives of civilian astronauts, so that makes anything they do expensive. But I think these private companies like Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin, these companies are going to be able to take high risks by launching adventurers into space, even if there's a 10 or 20% chance of failure.
Well, do you think it'll be humans? I mean, what gives us the original definition of the cyborg is the essay by Kleins and Klein, where they were looking at what we'd need to do to the human body in order to survive an extraterrestrial environment. And they were talking quite specifically about space, redesigning the body for a new environment. But do you think it's actually going to be our biological body as it is evolved here on Earth that's going to go to space? Or do you think we're closer to sending perhaps robots that we can later use as avatars, and what we'll end up doing is not sending our physical bodies into space, but we'll end up sending our minds? We'll communicate with these robotic avatars and control them and get the experience of being on this other planet, but our physical body can stay here on terra firma.
Yes, well, I mean, that's one scenario, but what I would say is that supposing a few crazy pioneers form a little colony on Mars, and they have one-way tickets, so they have to settle there, okay? Then they will find themselves ill-adapted to living on Mars, because we're adapted as humans to live on the Earth, which is very different. And so they will have every incentive to use these techniques, which will indeed be genetic modification, and perhaps also, as you say, cyborg modification, to adapt to this hostile environment. And they'll be away from the regulators, who I hope are going to constrain this being done here on Earth. And so within a century or two, then there will be these people on Mars who will be very different from us. And as you say, it could be that they will download themselves into robots, or there will be robots of intelligence at least comparable to humans, and then those robots, or those electronic descendants of human beings, they won't want an atmosphere. They may prefer zero G, so they will go off into space. And if they're electronic, they'll be near immortal, so an interstellar voyage won't be daunting to them. So that's a scenario for the far future, I think, that there will be electronic entities which will spread through the solar system and beyond. And I think although we want to, in my view, go slow on modifying human beings on the Earth, it probably will happen. And one thing I say in my book, which I find a slightly sad and scary thought, is that the one thing that hasn't changed over several millennia is human nature. And that's the reason why we can read classical literature and the Old Testament and all that, and admire the artifacts left by the Greeks and Romans and their literature, and feel an affinity with them, because human nature is the same now as it was for them. But I think there's perhaps a rather low chance that whatever the dominant entities say 500 years from now will have any affinity with us. They may have some algorithmic understanding of how we behaved, but they may be much more different from us than we were from the Romans and Greeks.
Well, if climate change goes the way that most are expecting, the Earth might be so inhospitable anyway that living on Mars might actually be the better option.
Well, I think Mars might be even worse, but I think to go back to climate change, I think it really is important that we do think long term enough to do something about it before it gets serious, because the situation is that there's a huge debate about the details of climate change, but most people agree there's a serious threat that by the end of a century we'll have crossed tipping points which will lead to very severe changes in the entire global climate. And it's worth paying an insurance premium now in order to avoid that. And the trouble is that some people aren't prepared to pay that insurance premium, and those who aren't prepared to do it are people like Born Lomborg, the environmental campaigner from Denmark. He's a bogeyman among some environmentalists, but it's slightly unfair because he doesn't contest the science. What he does, though, is he has a group of economists, and they apply quite a heavy discount rate to future benefits and future disbenefits. And for that reason, he downplays the priority of doing things that will make the climate safer in the second half of this century compared to more immediate ways of helping the world's poor.
Well, let's talk about one of these.
But the ethics of applying a discount rate in this context is very dubious, because most of us would say, and this is the conventional view that leads to our policy on climate change, is that you shouldn't discriminate on grounds of date of birth. You should care about the life chances of a baby born today who will still be alive in the 22nd century. You shouldn't apply a 3.5% discount rate, which means that you don't care about what happens after 2050. But the problem is to get public agreement to policies which do, in effect, provide this insurance that things won't get catastrophically bad later in the century.
Well, let's talk about one of the tipping points that features quite heavily in the book and that you've spoken about a lot, which is this idea of population growth and the fear around population growth, because you have a very nuanced perspective on the possibility of this idea that the population is going to grow to an unsustainable rate. And you go as far as saying it's impossible to define an optimum population or the world's ideal carrying capacity, and then you have very specific reasons for that. I just wonder if you could explain your position on population growth.
Yes. Well, I mean, first, the world's population has doubled in the last 50 years, from about 3.5 million billion in the 1960s to 7.8 billion now. But the projections are that it's leveling off. And in fact, the global birth rate has actually declined over the last few years. But even though that's the case, the population is destined almost certainly, barring a real catastrophe, to rise to about 9 billion by the middle of the century. And that's really for two reasons. Firstly, that the so-called demographic transition hasn't happened in sub-Saharan Africa, so the population is still rising fast there. And secondly, people are living longer. If you plot a histogram of the number of people at different ages, then for Western Europe, there are roughly equal numbers in every decade of age up to 70. Whereas if you do this for Africa, then the young, the under 20s, are about half the total population. And they're going to live longer, and so they're going to have 2 kids, and that will push up the population. So 9 billion by mid-century is almost inevitable. What happens after that is unpredictable. The population could go down, or it could keep on going up if, say, sub-Saharan Africa continues to have large families. We don't know. But I think we shouldn't panic too much about 9 billion by mid-century, because, as I say, we've managed to cope with a doubling of the population in 50 years. In the late 1960s, there were doom-laden forecasts by the Club of Rome and by people like Paul Ehrlich about mass starvation in the 70s and 80s, and they didn't happen. Food production managed to keep pace with population growth during that period. It's true there's still famines, but they're caused by maldistribution and wars, not by overall shortages. And if we look ahead to 2050, then I think especially if we use high-density agriculture, minimizing water use, etc., and GM technology, we can feed 9 billion people. But I think we'll have to eat less beef, because if all those 9 billion had the diet of present-day Americans, then that would lead to problems with global warming and land use, etc. So if we want to ensure people can be fed without producing too much CO2 and without encroaching on natural forests anymore, then average diet has to change. But there is, to quote Gandhi, enough for everyone's need, if not for everyone's greed, and we can feed 9 billion people. So I think there's no reason for panic on that. But on the other hand, if you ask what's the optimum population for the world, then it may be that it is less than 9 billion. And so maybe we should hope that the population does start to fall after 2050. And there are some scenarios where it does, because the population is already falling in Western Europe and Japan and places like that. And maybe we should hope that that happens in future.
Well, you say in the book it's not really quantity that's the issue, it's quality of these lives, because what's more dangerous than overpopulation is this idea of perceived inequality, as you call it in the book, global embitterment. And why is that even a greater threat than the idea of overpopulation? And if it is such a threat, how can we go about tackling it?
Well, I mean, I think, as I say, 9 billion can be fed, but it's not clear they will be, because that does depend on proper distribution. But I think one big concern, as I briefly mentioned, is what happens in Africa. If the population of sub-Saharan Africa goes on growing, if for cultural reasons families remain large, then, as in some of the UN projections, Africa's population would double again between 2050 and 2100, from 2 billion to 4 billion. And in that scenario, this is one of the UN projections, Nigeria would by 2100 have a population of 900 million, which is equal to Europe and North America added together. And if they are still caught by the poverty trap, they'll be lagging behind the rest of the world. And this is indeed a recipe for maximum embitterment, and would be unacceptable. And the reason it would be unacceptable is, first, the contrast between the wealthy world and Africa would then be very large. We want to minimize it. But secondly, there are two reasons why the situation would be more bitter then. First, the one thing that everyone would have in Africa is knowledge of the rest of the world. They will have internet, they will know what they're missing in a way that they didn't 100 years ago. So that's one thing. And secondly, they can't develop their economy in the way that the East Asian tigers did, for instance, by cheap manufacturing, because with robotics, manufacturing of that kind is being, in the jargon, reshored back into prosperous countries. So the countries of the Middle East and Africa which need economic development, they can't track what was done in Vietnam, Taiwan, and places like that. And this means that, in my opinion, if you want to have a fairly peaceful world in the second half of the century, then we've got to ensure that Africa and other regions don't lag behind. We need a mega version of the Marshall Aid Plan, whereby the United States helped out Europe 70 years ago after World War II. And I think it's going to be crucial that the wealthy countries ensure that the poor countries in the South don't get left behind. We should do this, and not just for altruistic reasons.
Now, I want to turn to a discussion of nature and discuss the appropriate relationship that humanity should have with nature, because there's so much talk of tech and re-engineering the environment and finding technological solutions to things like climate change, but should humanity actually look to nature as a collaborator rather than something that humanity should be seen to conquer? Is there a way in which we can enhance our understanding of nature and perhaps work with nature?
Yes, and this is why I was against any sort of drastic genetic modification of humans. And I think we ought to ensure that we do preserve the variety of nature. And this is not just because plants in the Amazon rainforest may have genes that are useful to us, not just for other reasons of human benefit, but because the variety of the natural world, the amazing beauty of nature, is something which many of us feel has value in its own right, over and above its importance for us as humans. And so we should preserve it. And of course, as you know, one of the consequences of the growing human impact on the environment and potential climate change is going to be mass extinctions. And I quote in my book the great Harvard ecologist E.O. Wilson, who says that if humans' collective actions lead to mass extinctions, it's a sin that future generations will least forgive us for. And I certainly resonate with that view. I think we ought to preserve nature. And for that reason, I think we ought to not take a science fiction picture when we completely change our planet, completely reform it. Maybe crazy people on Mars can do that out there, but we should leave things as they are. And I think that's what people want, because if you think of what wealthy people who have the choice do, then they tend to like to have a house with a big garden or park and things like that. They like to be among nature. And I think they also like to have human beings to help and support them. And that's why in my book I discuss the importance of not using robots to replace human beings as carers. People prefer to have a real human being for that. And that's the choice that rich people make, and we ought to make that possible for everyone. So I think that we want to realize that as human beings we have certain values, and we value the natural world, we value other human beings, and we don't want those things to change too fast.
So again, would you agree with the sort of eco-modernist perspective that it is better to rewild the earth rather than re-engineer the environment? Because it feels like nature is one of those things that already works at a global scale. It works irrespective of geopolitical borders. And do you think that if we just handed back 50% of the earth to Mother Nature, that she would just sort out the rest?
Well, we could, but we must be too romantic because, of course, I think many of us cherish the British landscape, which is very beautiful. But of course, that's in a sense artificial. 2,000 years ago, the British landscape had lots more forest, etc., and wasn't in many ways as beautiful as it is now. So I think it's not always the case that an artificial landscape is less good than natural landscape. I think we could say that much of the British landscape, which many of us appreciate, is in fact artificial. So what we've got to ensure is that it is one which actually enhances nature rather than destroys it.
I mean, to take it one step further, nature was here, or the notional idea of nature being the thing out there other than us. And nature was here long before us, and it really understood the networks that were required to allow for this planet to give rise to things like life. And do you think nature does a lot better job at understanding the intricate networks that allow for life to emerge rather than human beings? Do you think we're always going to be subservient to nature, or always have a better understanding of this thing than us?
Well, I think you're sounding rather like James Lovelock and Gaia.
That's not such a bad thing.
Indeed, that's right. And of course, as he would say, that the planet can look after itself. But that doesn't mean that what will happen will be good for humans. And I think as humans, we're entitled to consider our species and our survival, which may not happen in some scenarios which are good for the rest of the natural world. But we should surely have the knowledge and empowerment now to create a habitat which doesn't lead to massive extinctions and which is something we could admire and which doesn't destroy all the forest, etc. So I think we can have a symbiosis with nature which leaves space for human beings to nourish their lives.
Now, I want to turn to a theme that keeps coming up in this podcast, and it's the idea of the human subjective understanding of time and how that really impacts how we as collective humanity thinks about our future. But to start that off, I want to discuss your own relationship with time at both a human scale and a cosmic scale. And starting with that human scale, you've personally spent 78 years on this planet, and I want to understand how that passage of time has really impacted the way that you personally think about the future.
Well, I mean, I think obviously if you get to your 70s, you do have a different perspective on life. You look back on all the mistakes, etc., and realize the extent to which any good luck is pure luck. Yeah. This is why, incidentally, I've become ever more egalitarian in my views, because as I've lived long enough to follow people's careers, I've realized more and more how their success in a sort of commercial or careerist way is almost uncorrelated with their ability or the importance of their work. And I've just realized that more and more, and that has made me even more committed to a more egalitarian world than we have in this country in the future. That's one thing. But of course, we've got to think on longer time scales than ourselves. One thing that we do as human beings is surely appreciate the heritage of centuries past. We benefit from what the Victorians did and their structure, and we ought to ensure that we leave for future generations not a depleted and hostile planet, but one which is at least as good as the one we inherited. I think so. We've got to think in terms of a multi-generational welfare. And incidentally, there's an interesting apparent paradox here, which I discuss in my book. I talk about the cathedral builders. And I go to Ely Cathedral, which is only about 12 miles from where I live, and think of the people who built that about 800 years ago. They were people who, on the whole, had never travelled much beyond the Fens. That was their world. They knew of nothing beyond Europe. They thought the world would only last another 1,000 years. But nonetheless, they built a cathedral that wasn't finished in their lifetime and which still inspires us nearly a millennium later. In contrast, we don't think very much about leaving a legacy for future generations. And I think even though our horizon is measured in billions of years and we have a global conception which they didn't have. And the reason for this, actually, and the reason it's not so paradoxical, is that the Middle Ages were an era of slow change. And so even though the people didn't expect that the world would last more than 1,000 years, perhaps, they thought nonetheless that their children and their grandchildren would have lives rather like theirs. And they therefore appreciate the finished cathedral. So they were prepared to plan long term. The problem now is that even though we're all aware, and astronomers in particular are aware of the billions of years that lie ahead, we can't predict with confidence what things will be like 50 years from now, because change is so rapid. And some of us therefore take that as an excuse for not ensuring that there is good life for people 50 years from now, because we don't quite know what we should do to ensure it. So the rapid change is something which makes long-term planning harder now than it was for the Middle Ages.
Well, it does feel like this idea of cathedral thinking is beginning to re-emerge, especially under the climate movement. But it has a new neologism. It's called intergenerational obligations.
Yes.
This idea that we have to consider the rights of those who aren't yet born, the possible people. I mean, how do we do that?
Well, I mean, I think ethically we should, and we're saying this. If we do that, and if we care about the life chance of a baby born today who'll be alive at the beginning of the 22nd century, then we ought to be prepared to pay a big insurance premium to eliminate the probability of a serious climatic disaster by the end of the century and tipping points being crossed, etc. So I think we've got to do what we can to reinstate long-term thinking, certainly, as you say, in the context of climate, where if we do things wrong in the next 20 years, then future generations will curse us because it'll be too late for them to actually reverse the global heating that will be happening then. So I think we do have to instill, as far as we can, and draw on religions to help us, this long-term concern. And this is really a consequence of what I said at the beginning, which is that this is the first century when human beings, one species, are sufficiently empowered that they can determine the future of the entire planet and the entire biosphere. We have a new responsibility.
I wonder if there's something that we can learn from religion here, because I look at your accommodationist approach to religion, where although you don't necessarily believe in a god, you're happy to engage with the culture of Christianity. And I wonder if religion had something there. I wonder whether your accommodationist approach to religion is because you recognize religion's ability to garner some form of consensus when it comes to thinking about the future. In other words, do you think we could all do with a little more faith that we're going to make it through?
Well, I think so, and I think the point about religion, and I quote in my book the papal encyclical, which was a big influence on the 2015 Paris Climate Conference, which got a consensus, and the papal encyclical, which was inspired by the Papal Academy, was important, and he got a standing ovation at the UN. And it's had a big influence on his billion followers in Latin America, Africa, and East Asia. And whatever one thinks of the Catholic Church, and the many things that we may not support, there's no denying that its global reach, its long-term view, and its care for the world's poor. And so I think the religions do remind us that we are just one generation of many, and they do instill long-term thinking, so that we don't discount the future in the way that economists normally do. And they also make us perhaps care about the rest of nature.
I want to return to these concepts of time and how our thinking about time really does affect our thinking about the future. And it feels like in the modern world today, we have this dominant narrative, this dominant concept of lineal time. And lineal time has really informed our modern understanding of progress, that lineal time, that there's the past, the present, and there's a potential future. That future, in the case of lineal time, always feels like it's going to be better than today. And also lineal time really has informed our belief that there's an inevitability of an endpoint. The story has to end at some point. What do you think the effect of this concept of lineal time has had on our perception of how we think about the future?
Well, I think they're two separate things. One is we are lulled into complacency if we think that there'll be continuing improvements. There can be steady improvements for a decade or two or more, and then some sudden catastrophe. We know the mini versions of this in the stock market, where it goes up for 10 or 20 years and then sudden decline. And we have disasters like the present pandemic, which are a setback by a few years. So we've got to realize that there are these setbacks, and we can't expect continuing improvements for more than a decade or two. And indeed, the main theme of my book is the stakes are getting higher, because there's a new class of disasters that cascade globally. But of course, the other point, and again speaking as an astronomer, is that the time lying ahead is enormous. We know that we are the outcome of nearly 4 billion years of biological evolution from the first protozoa, as it were, by Darwinian selection. But astronomers know that the Earth's got 6 billion more years before the sun flares up and dies, and the entire universe may go on forever. And to quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So astronomers would never think of us humans as being the culmination of evolution. We may not even be the halfway stage, because there's more time ahead. Now, of course, it could be that life is unique to the Earth, and our ineptness this century snuffs out all the potentialities. But on the other hand, it's possible that evolution will continue in the future for billions of years more. And if that happens, evolution is going to happen much faster, because it won't be Darwinian selection, which takes hundreds of thousands of years to change one species into another. It will be what I would call secular intelligent design. It'll be us or our more intelligent successors who will redesign entities, and this could lead to changes here on Earth and far beyond, on timescales of only centuries. So the time lying ahead is longer than the time that's elapsed up till now, and moreover, the pace of change is going to be faster, because it's going to be a technological timescale rather than the slow Darwinian timescale. And that means it's utterly hopeless to conceive or attempt to predict what's going to happen in the really far future. But certainly, as astronomers, we are aware that there is this far future for our galaxy and our universe, whatever happens to us down here on the Earth.
I mean, do you think we should just get rid of the notion of linear time altogether? Should we be embracing a more cyclical notion of time? Would this be useful? Basically, an understanding of time that emphasizes repetition and is influenced by the cycles that are apparent in the natural world. I mean, at the end of the day, what is wrong with a little bit of creative destruction every now and then if it gives us these new opportunities to find new avenues of exploration?
Well, it might, but I mean, in the long run, if you look over billions of years, of course, Darwinian evolution has, of course, not proceeded smoothly. The dinosaurs could tell you that, but there has been a gradual emergence of complexity over those billions of years. But we are now in a special state when, as I say, future evolution is not going to be Darwinian selection, and so it is going to be up to us how it happens. So I don't think we can sort of recycle things in the way that might have happened in the past.
But just to hear me out once more on this idea of cyclical
Yes.
time, do you think the cyclical understanding could also be applied to the cosmic scale? I mean, what are your thoughts on the idea that the universe is not just expanding infinitely, but soon it might also contract? In other words, what expands contracts. So we've had the Big Bang, and this may lead to the
Yes.
Big Crunch, and that will lead to
Yes.
potentially another Big Bang. And I
Yes,
think that
yes.
concept is better known as loop quantum cosmology. Do you think if it is to be proven that in actual fact maybe this is the way the universe is going to go, it's going to be this constant expansion and contraction, this more cyclical process rather than expansion into something that's so much better or far
Yes.
away, do you think that would spark Copernican I always struggle to pronounce that, Copernican, style
Yes.
revolution when it comes to thinking about the passing of time?
Well, I don't think so, because I mean, as you say, well, long-range forecasts are never reliable, and
All right.
the entire cosmos, there are ideas that it will eventually recollapse to a big crunch. The most likely thing is it does go on expanding forever, but in any case, we are talking there about timescales far longer, millions of times longer than human history. And so it's not, I think, relevant to the way we think of ourselves as humans. So I think there's such a big disjunction between the timescales that cosmologists think about and those that even the most far-sighted politician or priest thinks, that it doesn't really help. I think we've got to just say we don't know what will happen on that very long timescale. But we do think of ourselves as an important stage between 45 million centuries on the evolution of the Earth, and this one is special, and there'll be another 50 million centuries, 60 million centuries before the Earth dies, and we don't know what's going to happen in those.
Now I'm going to turn to YouTube questions in a second. So now is the perfect time to put your questions into the YouTube live chat if you have them for Martin. But before we do turn to some of the questions that we have from
Yes.
our audience, I want to talk about some of the current methods of thinking about tomorrow and how they're hampered by short-term thinking, by polarising debates, by alarmist rhetoric, and by pessimism. And I want to ask you, Martin, why is the public still in so much denial about the harm we're causing both to the biosphere and the threats posed by our interconnected world?
Well, I think for the biosphere, it's the question that they don't think long term enough, and politicians in particular don't think long term because they worry about the next election. I quote Mr. Jean-Paul Juncker in my book, who says that politicians know what to do, they don't know how to get re-elected if they've done it. And so the politicians tend to react in a short time. But you shouldn't blame them. That's because the public are like that. The public won't vote for them if you don't. And so one thing which I say in my book is that it's very important for scientists and any sort of charismatic people who speak for them to make people aware of these things. I mean, in the 60s, there were people like Rachel Carson and etc., who made people care about the environment. And we've got people like David Attenborough now. And I think they can make a big difference. And just to give one example, in the UK recently, Mr. Michael Gove is not perhaps the most inspirational long-term thinker, but he did, when he was in his previous role, introduce legislation to ban non-reusable plastic straws and things like that. Now, he did that because he thought, probably rightly, that the public and the voters would support it. And the reason that was the case was that millions of them had watched the Attenborough Blue Planet 2 programs, particularly the one showing the albatross returning to its nest and coughing up for its young, not the longed-for nourishment, but bits of plastic. That's an iconic picture, rather like the polar bear and the melting ice flow is for the climate things. And so that was an example where a charismatic, inspirational figure like David Attenborough was able to make people think about a long-term issue, which wasn't on their radar at all until 2 or 3 years ago. People didn't talk about plastics in the ocean, whereas that's become a serious issue. And the same is happening, but not enough for climate change. The campaigns and demonstrations, especially by young people, are to be welcome because they are making people think long term. But scientists themselves can't do it without getting the public on side, and the politicians will only respond if they think the public and voters will support them. And that's why the Pope in 2015 and our secular Pope David Attenborough more recently have been so important in raising public consciousness of these long-term issues.
But the public also has to make an informed decision, don't they? It's one thing to appeal to their emotions, but it's another thing to actually educate them on the real science. And how do we enhance both the public and the political discourse over long-term scientific and global trends? Because even if we just look at what happened with COVID-19 and some of the response that the public, especially in the US, has had, it often seems like, despite the science, people just follow the route that they want to take.
Well, I mean, I think that's true, and there is widespread ignorance of even basic science. You don't need to be an expert in science to understand these things, but you need to have a feel for science. But incidentally, I think scientists sometimes complain too much because we should bemoan ignorance in all areas. I mean, it's sad if people don't know the difference between a proton and a protein and don't understand basic feats of climate or anatomy or disease and things like that. But it's equally sad if they don't know the history of their country, because that's important if you want to make an informed judgment. So I think we've got to hope that basic knowledge is more widespread so that public debate, which is crucial in a democracy, gets above Daily Mail slogans. And it will only do that if the public has at least some feel for science. But as I say, it's equally important that the public should have some feel for the history of our nation and should be able to find South Korea or Libya on the map, which many can't.
I mean, how do we apply that? How do we apply that to our thinking about technologies and the decisions we make over which technologies we should accelerate and which technologies we should responsibly constrain? Because, again, it feels like the ability to make an informed decision is often hampered by monetary incentives, for example, and those monetary and incentives of shareholders of certain technological companies often outweigh the greater good for humanity. So how do we make those sorts of informed decisions when it comes to the application of some of this science?
Well, I think we do need regulation. I mean, going back to biotech, for instance, we do need regulations on grounds of safety and on grounds of ethics of certain technologies. My worry about that is that there are some technologies that are dangerous, and we want regulations globally, but enforcing regulations globally in biotech, for instance, is as hopeless as enforcing the drug laws globally or the tax laws globally. And that's why I do worry about the misuse of biotech, etc. Also, we need powerful international bodies which can enforce these regulations. And of course, in dealing with large multinational conglomerates, as we have in the IT arena, clearly it's got to be some international regulation of them. And we don't yet have that, but that's what we need if we want to minimize the risk of really disastrous downsides of the new technology. And it is difficult because in the case of nuclear, which you talked about earlier, nuclear facilities to make nuclear bombs are large and special purpose, and it's possible for the International Atomic Energy Agency to regulate them. But of course, the kind of experiments that could be dangerous or unethical in biology can be done in a small dual-purpose lab, of which there are many. So it's harder to enforce regulations in that arena. And similarly, cyberattacks of growing impact can be carried out just by few people, even a loner. And so I do think we'll have a bumpy ride, because it'll be hard to prevent a few people misusing these powerful technologies. And I like to say that the global village will have its village idiots, and they will have a global range. And if we want to cope with that, we have to contend with a tension between three things we want to preserve: liberty, security, and privacy. And one of those has to give. In China, it's privacy that's going to give. In the West, it may be something else. But I think if we want to ensure that when the stakes are so high, we bring down to a reasonable low level the probability of some bad actor causing catastrophe, we do have to worry about how we can have adequate surveillance.
Do you think there's a methods issue here when it comes to thinking about and trying to predict the future? Now, I should probably just make it very, very clear to our audience that you're an astronomer, not an astrologer. Those are two entirely different things, and one happens to deal quite a lot with trying to predict the future. Because in the current century, it feels like futurism has become a data-based science. We seem to be obsessed with modeling the present and the past to try and work out what might happen in the future. But what if we end up making false assumptions about our future based on very limited data in both the past and the present? Do you think there's an issue here, an underlying issue with our methods for how we try to understand, look at, and eventually predict the future?
Well, of course, I'm a scientist, not an astrologer, and scientists are pretty rotten forecasters. All I'd say is they're not as bad as economists, but they can't be reliable. And even with very good data, then, as you say, one can't make confident forecasts very far ahead. So we do have to live with uncertainty and do our best to cope with it. And we've got to in my view, explore scenarios for things that might happen, things that might go wrong, and prepare against them. And the centre I'm involved in Cambridge, called the Centre for Studying Extreme Risks, is concerned to give more attention to these high consequence, low probability threats, which tend to be not studied enough. There's lots of study of risks like carcinogens in food, cutting down road accidents and things of that kind, but not enough to these major events. And we saw in the case of the COVID-19 that we weren't adequately prepared. We didn't have the adequate equipment to deal with it, whereas in retrospect it would have been a reasonable investment, given that no reasonable person would have thought that the probability of such an event was lower than, say, once per 20 years.
Do you think, talking about these, or talking about exploring the multitude of possible scenarios for the future, do you think science fiction has an important role to play in preparing the public for what could potentially be possible?
I think it does, and I tell my students that they'll do far better to read first-rate science fiction than second-rate science. It's more fun and no more likely to be wrong. So I think it does nourish the imagination. So I certainly recommend that. And when you were talking earlier about cyclic events, I was reminded of a book by Olav Stapleton. He was a underappreciated science fiction writer, and he wrote a book called Last and First Men. He wrote his book in the mid-1930s. And it's about, I think it's about 15 species of intelligences and brains that emerge and decay over the next few billion years. And he was very imaginative, because we all know Arthur C. Clarke, and Stapleton wrote another book called Star Maker, the Star Maker is a creator of universes, and he had the idea of a multiverse and different dimensions and all that. So that's a long way of saying that I think it's very inspiring to read some science fiction. In fact, I always recommend a book by two people I knew called Stewart and Cohen, called Aliens, which gives a digest of about 50 science fiction novels, because science fiction is not always the most excellent literature, but it's lovely to have the digest of the ideas in it. And this particular book digested the ideas from about 50 books, and we should do that. But that's a long way of saying that science fiction writers have a lot to teach us and to nourish our imagination.
Do you think we'll ever see a Lord Martin Rees science fiction book?
I don't think I've got the imagination, actually. I mean, I'm going to write books about science and the future of the inanimate universe. And I like to say that the inanimate world of atoms and stars and galaxies is simple compared to the biological world. And even an insect is far more complicated with its layer upon layer of structure than a star or a galaxy. So I will stick to simple things, the inanimate world, but I will enjoy reading books by people with more imagination than I can possess.
Well, if you'll indulge me just for a second, you mention in the book very briefly possible ways we might overcome the extinction level event, or how we might actually recover from the extinction level event, and you point at what James Lovelock has been talking about, which is this idea of a handbook for survival. So what would you include in a James Lovelock-esque handbook for the survival of humanity after the extinction event?
Well, of course, going back to what I said about our lack of education in the basic science, I think we'd all be completely helpless in even simple agriculture, because we are further from nature than any early generation was. So what I think I would do is make sure that everyone in school learns a bit more about how to grow food, basic human anatomy and things like that, which they will need. And Lovelock had this idea of having this handbook and distributing robust copies all around the world, so it existed. And I could plug another book by Lewis Dartnell called The Knowledge, which again I refer to in my book, and he summarizes the kind of things we would need to know, going up to smelting iron and things like that, if we were to revert to a sort of Stone Age culture and have to start again from there.
Well, we have a question from YouTube about education, actually, from Ava Pascoe of Cyber Salon, who asks, should we be teaching astronomy and perspectives on long-term thinking in schools?
I think we should be teaching basic astronomy. I think it's sad if people don't understand what causes the tides or what the sun is made of and things like that. But I think people ought to understand history, that our civilization is the outcome of an imprint that goes back for thousands of years, and also they should understand the natural world. And I think what is very sad is that young people are more cut off from the natural world than ever before. And incidentally, I gave a talk at a science festival recently where I made the point that the fact that the technology that young people use today is so elaborate is itself an impediment to getting them keen on science. Because when I was young, you could take apart a motorbike engine or simple radio, something like that, and put it together again and understand how it works. Whereas the gadgets that young people use now, smartphones and things like that, you can't possibly understand how they work. And if you take them apart, you can't put them together again. I think if you look at the careers of most people of early generations who ended up being scientists or engineers, they were sort of tinkerers when they were young. And going right back to Newton, who made models of windmills and clocks, the high tech of his time. And also biologists looked at bird nests and things like that. And young people now can't understand the technology that their everyday life depends on, and they've probably never seen a bird's nest in many cases. And I think it's rather sad that education doesn't give people the opportunity to engage with the natural world now. And of course, if they did, then they might value it more and think longer term.
As expected, we've had questions from our YouTube audience, specifically on space, and I guess I'd certainly be remiss if I didn't ask you about space. And one of those questions is from Lisa Pettibone, who asks, could a settlement on the moon help us develop innovative solutions to our problems here on Earth, and be a stepping stone to living and traveling in space?
Well, the answer is it could be a stepping stone, but as I say, I'm not enthusiastic about massive evacuation of the Earth to live in space, because we're not suited to it. We should realize that as robots and miniaturization get better, the practical need for people in space, even to do mining or build large structures on the moon, is getting weaker. As an astronomer, I hope there will be a big radio telescope on the far side of the moon, where there's no radio background from the Earth. That could be assembled by robots. And so I think we can make use of space for technology, but we can also do industry in space. We can have huge telescopes in space, gossamer thin, built under zero G. And I hope that we will use these to get a really detailed image of distant parts of the universe. And just to mention one thing, one of the most exciting things in astronomy in the last 20 years has been realizing that most of the other stars in the sky are orbited by retinues of planets, just like the Earth is orbited by the familiar planets. And we can only detect these as little points. We can't image one of them. But if we had a huge telescope in space, we could perhaps get an image of another Earth, maybe with a biosphere, orbiting another star. That's a big challenge. It needs a really big telescope. But I say in my book that this is a challenge to achieve by the year 2068. Why do I say 2068? That's a centenary of the famous Earthrise picture, showing the Earth as viewed by astronauts orbiting the moon, which was iconic among environmentalists. And let's hope that sometime, maybe a century later, we will have an image of another Earth orbiting another sun.
Well, we have a telescope that's due to go up very soon. I think as soon as 2021, which is the James Webb Telescope.
That's right. Yes.
What do you hope that the James Webb Telescope might discover?
Well, it won't do that. It will do a lot more. It will be able to analyze the light from very distant objects, and therefore look back far into the past. Even better than that is going to be a telescope on the ground built by a European consortium, which Britain belongs to, which is a telescope being built in Chile with a mirror 39 meters across. It's a mosaic of 800 bits of glass, and it's got the name the ELT, Extremely Large Telescope. The Europeans aren't very imaginative in their nomenclature. But anyway, that telescope should be able to analyze the light from planets around other stars. This is a challenge because you're looking for a far-flying extra searchlight, as it were. You're looking at another star, which is like the sun, and you're looking at a planet which is fainter to it by the same factor that the Earth is fainter than the sun. So you need a big telescope. But when we have this telescope, it'll be possible to perhaps learn whether there's oxygen or chlorophyll or things like that on some of the planets orbiting other stars. The James Webb Telescope will be a step towards that, but the big ones on the ground will be more important.
I had a special request from an audience member, Ben Greenaway, who wanted me to ask you about your opinion on both Donald Trump's idea of a Space Force and Elon Musk's distracting array of Starlink satellites. So I just wanted your opinion on both of those things.
Well, I mean, I think one knows about them both. I mean, obviously, Donald Trump's motivation is to emphasize the use of space as an arena for war, and not only to launch weapons from and also to attack other satellites. So I think any expansion of that effort is something we should deplore. The Musk system of having thousands of satellites, the intention is good, it's to bring internet to Africa and other places where they don't have broadband internet. So that's the motive. But of course, the downside is that these objects will be in a fairly low orbit, and they will be a bit of a distraction to astronomers. The good thing, I would say, is that the people at SpaceX, they're mindful of these concerns. They're trying to avoid these small spacecraft having shiny surfaces, etc. But still, they will be a bit of an impediment to observations, but just after sunset and before sunrise, because they're in low Earth orbits, so there's no sun shining on them in the middle of the night.
If, say, in the next 10 to 20 years, we finally crack commercial spaceflight and it becomes viable, would you, yourself, would you consider going to space?
Well, I imagine that Elon Musk has said that he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. He's 49 years old now, so he might make it. I think I'd want to be even more old and decayed before I took the risk. And I say that because I personally think that there'll never be a case for Europe or America funding massive space exploits, because, as I say, robots can do everything better and much more cheaply. And if a government does something, it's got to have very high safety standards to indicate that. The shuttle NASA had was launched 135 times. It had 2 spectacular failures. Each of those was a national trauma. But that was a less than 2% failure rate, which is fine for most test pilots or astronauts and adventurers. So my view is that manned spaceflight should be left to the private sector, which means Musk and Bezos and people like that, because they can launch adventurers prepared to accept high risks, and they can therefore have cut price risky ventures, and we can cheer them on. I don't think I would go myself.
Well, we have one last question from YouTube, and it's a 2-part question really. It's from Ava Pascoe, who asks, what inspired you, or who inspired you to study astronomy, and what are the big unanswered questions left in astronomy that you think are a priority to answer?
Well, as you say, my own path into it was sort of accident. I was good at maths at school and bad at languages, so I specialised in maths in my last years, and studied it in universities and undergraduate. I rather wish I'd studied science instead. I'd have done better if I'd done more science then. And then by lucky accidents, I got into astronomy to do a PhD, and this was the mid-60s, a very good time, because that's when subject was opening up, the first evidence for black holes, first evidence of the Big Bang, and things like that. And I advise any young people listening now, if you are thinking about going into science, pick a subject where new things are happening, where you can get new data, use new techniques or more powerful computers, and then you can tackle the problems that the old guys never got a chance to tackle. If you go into a more slowly developing subject, then you have to do the things that the old guys got stuck on, and that's less likely to lead to success. But the good thing I would say is that although the 60s were an exciting time, the most recent 5 years have been just as exciting. We had very exciting developments in planets around other stars, which I mentioned, more evidence on the Big Bang and more on dark matter, etc. So I would say that the subject's developed very fast, and as in all of science, as the frontiers advance, then old questions get settled and new questions come into view which couldn't have been posed beforehand. So, and the periphery gets longer, so there's more and more to do. So it's a great subject, and it now links together with geology and biology if we think about exoplanets. So that's a long answer to say that I got into astronomy just by a chain of accidents, and I've been lucky that it's been a subject which has developed fast, and also it's a subject which has a a wide attraction to the public, and also an unambiguously positive image. I mean, people are slightly ambivalent about nuclear science and genetics because it can be used for good or ill. But I think if you do astronomy or evolutionary biology, then I think the public is surprisingly interested. I'm always gratified that the public is interested in these subjects. The question that I'm most often asked, we haven't got round to in this conversation, is there life out there already? That's what really grabs people's interest. But that's indeed a very important question.
Well, it feels like we're understanding more and more about the world through science and about just the nature of reality itself. But there are some challenges that come with imagining the unimaginable, and part of that is a built-in human limit to our understanding. Do you think there's some things that we will just never know because they're beyond the power of the human mind to grasp, or will these concepts eventually be grasped by things like artificial intelligence, for example?
Well, I'm sure there are things that we're unaware of, which may be far too hard for us to grasp. I mean, just like a monkey can't understand quantum theory, so there may be things that we can never grasp. You asked about AI. I mean, I think there's a bit too much hype about what AI can do, but it can certainly do very complicated calculations and do them very fast. And if you think of understanding, say, string theory, which involves geometry in 10 or 11 dimensions, and which may help us to understand the very early stages of the Big Bang, I can certainly conceive that there may be a possibility that a machine, beefed up version of the DeepMind machine that beat the world champion at the game of Go, which might be able to understand, or not understand, but at least calculate 11-dimensional geometry and explore the consequences of string theory in a way that's just too difficult or too long for a human to do. And if the machine then spews out at the end the correct mass for a proton or correct strength of gravity, etc., we'd know that there was something in the theory. You wouldn't have this sort of aha insight, which is the main bonus you get if you make a scientific discovery, because we wouldn't have the insight, but we would at least know through this idea aided by a machine whether a particular string theory was correct. There may be some things which are even too hard for the machine.
I keep arguing that the next Einstein will be an A-Einstein, but
well, I don't think so, because I think the ideas will still, I think, come from humans, whereas the machines have the advantage of speed and processing power, so they can do they can do things far faster than us. I mean, the computer that beat the world champion in Go, it learnt in 3 hours just because of the rules by playing against itself and became better than any human. So that's the kind of success they have. But the thing that machines can't learn is common sense and about humans, because they can only do that by watching real humans in real situations. And the problem is twofold. The first is that we don't have such good sensors. They can't sense the world as well as we do. But secondly, everything that we do is very slow by the standard of machine. So you can't give the machine a data set of real human beings. It's like us watching trees grow. You can't learn very much just in a lifetime. And so that's why there's a big concern about the extent to which machines will ever sort of acquire common sense. And that's relevant to how much we should be prepared to delegate routine choices to machines without being sure that there are humans in the loop.
So, Martin, you do such a wonderful job in this book of balancing your optimism with your anxiety, with balancing speculation and science. But for our audience, how do we all become evangelists for new technologies without looking blissfully naive and looking too techno-optimist? How do we do that ourselves? What is your message for our audience this evening?
Well, I think we do need to be cautious in the way we apply these powerful technologies. I mean, that's certainly a theme of my book. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that we we develop these technologies. Obviously, they have huge benefits for health, and also for monitoring complex systems like electricity grids, monitored by AI, and traffic flows, etc. And the Chinese could have a planned economy of a kind that Marx could only dream of, because they can register and process every transaction made in the entire country. So there are things which machines can do, but there are also downsides to what they can do. And I think the main point is that people shouldn't be too starry-eyed about science, and they should, without being experts, obviously, have enough feel for what science can and cannot do. And only then can we have a sort of informed debate, which we should be having in democracy, about how to deploy these new techniques.
And on that very level-headed end note, I want to thank everybody for joining us for this Futures Podcast live stream event. Please subscribe to this YouTube account to be alerted to all of our upcoming episodes and events. If you like what you've heard, then you can download the Futures Podcast on your favorite podcasting app, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Futures Podcast. More episodes, events, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Martin's book on the future, Prospects for Humanity, is available from Princeton Press now. And Lord Martin Rees, I just want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.